roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll.
Have say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll.
Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. I roll like tumbleweed, need wine, whiskey, beer for fear,
and lose the reason. This life is my prison.
I feel like a burning cage, I'm not right from this age.
The fire burning inside, I don't feel right.
I say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. They say you are wrong, you have to do. I don't want you at the boo.
They say you are bad, you feel with your head.
They destroy the world, only for money, how you go.
They say we are right,
but I know we lie. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, ever mad, mad. You ever lie, ever ride. Ever say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. Ever say, rock and roll. Say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. I'd say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie, rock and roll, ever ride, rock and roll. I'd say, rock and roll, ever mad, mad, rock and roll. You ever lie.